She told him her husband was dead. She had a death certificate. She had a story. The Swiss Alps, a multi-car collision, a ravine, a body that could not be recovered. She had grieved. Publicly, privately, in the specific long way of a woman who has lost someone and taken years to put herself back together. She had put herself back together so well, in fact, that she had become one of the most respected hospital directors in Chicago. She had built a new life. She had found a new love. She had married again, this time to a defense attorney with an unshakable reputation and the kind of courtroom confidence that made other lawyers uncomfortable. Xavier Holt thought he had found his person. He thought his wife's tragedy was behind her. And then, the heavy oak doors of a fundraiser ballroom swung open, and the dead man walked in. Welcome to corporate chaos scandals, the place for the most shocking and unbelievable workplace confession stories. From office drama to hidden secrets, nothing is off limits. Before we get into this, make sure you subscribe and like, because we bring you stories like this every week. Let us start with Xavier, because this story begins and ends with Xavier Holt. And to understand what the next 2 years of his life felt like, you have to understand who he was before the doors opened. Xavier was 41 years old, a criminal defense attorney in Chicago with a practice that had been built over 15 years on two things: an extraordinary memory for precedent and an absolute refusal to show anything in a courtroom that he did not intend to show. He had a reputation for composure under pressure that his colleagues discussed with something approaching professional envy. He had been cross-examined in disciplinary proceedings once, a complaint filed against him that was ultimately dismissed, and the partner at the opposing firm had told a mutual acquaintance afterward that Xavier Holt under pressure was the most controlled human being he had ever been across a table from. He had been through a divorce in his late 30s. His first marriage, to a woman named Denise, had ended after 9 years for reasons that Xavier described, on the rare occasions he described them at all, as a mutual recognition that the people they had become were not the people who had married each other. This was not a bitter account. It was an honest one. The marriage had produced no children and had left Xavier in the specific position of a man in his late 30s, who had rebuilt himself from a significant loss, and who was, by the time he met Krista, someone who had done the internal work rather than simply moved on. He had met Krista Elaine Monroe. He always used both names. He liked the sound of it, at a gala for emerging artists in Chicago. She was there as a patron of the gallery that had organized the event. He was there because a client of his had a piece in the show and had given him 2 tickets that he had almost not used. They had found themselves at the same wine table at the same moment and had spoken for 20 minutes before either of them moved. She was 37 years old, the director of Mercy General Hospital, not an administrator in the bureaucratic sense, but a genuine leader who had rebuilt the hospital's surgical wing over 4 years in a way that had attracted national attention and 2 significant research grants. She was poised and precise and warm in the specific, measured way of someone who had learned warmth as something you extended deliberately because you understood its value, rather than something that leaked out of you without your involvement. She had told him about Caleb on their 3rd date, not the full account, the necessary account, her husband, the Swiss Alps, a road trip that had become something else on a mountain pass, a collision involving 4 vehicles, a ravine that the recovery teams had not been able to access fully in the winter conditions, an official death certificate issued by the Swiss authorities after the standard waiting period, based on the circumstances and the absence of a recovered body. She had been a widow for 3 years when she met Xavier. He had listened to all of this with the attention he brought to everything. He had asked careful questions. she had answered them. He had seen in the specific quality of how she talked about it. Not performed grief, not manufactured detail, but the particular, settled heaviness of someone who has processed something real and arrived at the other side of it. Something he recognized from his own experience of reconstructing a life. He had fallen in love with her, completely and deliberately, in the way that a man who has done the internal work falls in love the second time. Not in the way that sweeps you off your feet, but in the way that plants itself and grows while you are paying attention. They had married in Amalfi, a cliffside ceremony, 20 guests, the Mediterranean below them. Xavier had written his own vows and had done it with the precision he brought to legal writing, specific, earned, without a wasted word. He had told a colleague the following week in the specific, unguarded way that significant happiness produces. I think I understand now why people talk about finding their person. I didn't know what that meant before. The fundraiser was 18 months into their marriage. A hospital event, a gala for the expansion of Mercy General's surgical wing, the project that had been Krista's central professional focus for 4 years, and that was, by this point, fully funded and entering its final construction phase. The room was full of the specific category of people who attend hospital fundraisers: medical professionals, philanthropists, a scattering of politicians, a larger scattering of people whose wealth made them useful to institutions that needed resources. Xavier knew several people in the room professionally. Krista knew almost everyone. He was mid-sentence. He has said this in every account he has given since. He was specifically mid-sentence, describing the scope of the surgical wing expansion to a cardiologist whose name he cannot now recall when the quality of the room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once. It was a ripple more than a wave, a shift in the attention of the people nearest the main entrance, a slight turning of heads, the specific quality of a room that has had its attention redirected by something at its edge. Xavier turned. A man was standing in the entrance of the ballroom. Leaner than his photographs, and Xavier had seen the photographs, the ones that Krista kept in a bedside drawer that he had never opened but was aware of with the particular awareness of a person who knows something is there and has chosen to leave it alone. Leaner, and marked by a faint surgical scar along the jawline that had not been there in the photographs. But the eyes were the same. The way he held his head was the same. Xavier was a man who prided himself on his composure under pressure. He had been across the table from murderers and cross-examined by opposing counsel trying to dismantle everything he had built. He did not rattle. The wine glass in his hand slipped. It did not just fall. It shattered against the edge of the table in a way that cut through the low conversation of the room and made people turn toward the sound. He was not aware of the glass until he felt the stem between his fingers, and then he felt nothing. And then he looked down, and there were pieces on the floor. The cardiologist said, "Are you all right?" Xavier did not answer. He was looking at the man in the doorway, the man who had the eyes of Caleb Monroe, the man who was, if what Xavier was seeing was real and not some catastrophic misfire of his own recognition systems, Krista's dead husband. And then he looked at Krista, and in the half-second before she controlled her face, in the half-second between the moment she registered the figure in the doorway and the moment the composure that she had built her professional life on clicked into place, Xavier Holt, the most controlled man in any room he entered, saw something that the defense attorney in him cataloged immediately and involuntarily and with devastating clarity. It was not the shock of a woman seeing a ghost. It was the specific, instantaneous, body-level response of a woman seeing someone she had not expected to see here, now, in this room. not someone she had believed was dead, someone she had believed would not be here. The next 48 hours were the longest of Xavier's adult life, and he is a man who has spent nights before trial in hotel rooms running every possible catastrophic scenario through his mind's version of a worst-case engine. He was not a stranger to sleeplessness or to the specific weight of a problem that had no clean solution. Caleb Monroe. And he was Caleb Monroe. This was not a misidentification. DNA and documentation established this within 10 days. Had come to the fundraiser because he had seen the event listed in a hospital communications newsletter that he received because he had, in the period of reconstruction following his accident, registered with Mercy General's outpatient rehabilitation program. He had not planned the confrontation. He had not known that Krista would be there as the director rather than as a patient or a donor. He had simply seen the event, decided to attend, and walk through the door. His account of the preceding 3 years was, on its surface, extraordinary. He had been in the multi-vehicle collision on the Alpine Pass. He had survived, but with injuries that had included a significant traumatic brain injury that had produced, in the initial period of recovery, a form of retrograde amnesia severe enough that he did not know who he was. He had been found by the emergency services of a different canton than the one responding to the primary accident. He had apparently been thrown clear of the vehicle in circumstances that the accident reconstruction could not fully account for, and had been treated in a regional hospital under an unidentified patient status for 11 weeks before the amnesia began to clear. The clearing had been gradual and nonlinear, as recovery from this type of injury tends to be. He had recovered language before memory. He had recovered basic biographical facts, his name, his city, before he recovered the relational context. By the time he understood fully who he was and what had happened, the death certificate had been issued. The estate had been in process for 6 months, and the world had, in the formal legal and administrative sense, moved on. He had spent the following year in rehabilitation and in the specific disorienting process of reintegrating himself into a life that had legally continued without him. He had not contacted Krista immediately. He said he had needed to be certain of himself before he walked back into her life. He said he had been advised by his medical team to take the reintegration slowly. Xavier heard this account from his own investigator rather than from Caleb directly in the first instance, because Xavier Holt had, within 36 hours of the fundraiser, engaged the most thorough private investigation firm he had worked with in 15 years of criminal defense work, and had instructed them to find out everything. He was a lawyer. The miracle had started to smell like a conspiracy before the shattered glass had been swept from the fundraiser floor. What the investigation found was not a simple picture. The amnesia was real. The medical documentation was genuine and had been verified by the Swiss healthcare authorities. The recovery timeline was consistent with a significant traumatic brain injury of the type documented. The delay in contacting Krista could be explained by the medical account. None of this was fabricated. What the investigation also found, threading through the verified medical account, was a set of financial facts that required a different kind of explanation. Caleb Monroe had, in the 2 years before the accident, accumulated a significant amount of debt. Not from recklessness, from a business venture that had gone seriously wrong in a way that left him personally exposed through a guarantor arrangement he had entered into with more optimism than due diligence. The debt was real, documented, and at the time of the accident had been in a state of active collection proceedings. The death certificate had discharged that debt, legally and completely. A death certificate does that. When Caleb Monroe died in the Swiss Alps, Caleb Monroe's debts died with him. In the 2 years since the death certificate, with the debts discharged and his identity technically belonging to a dead man, Caleb had rebuilt. A new employer in a different sector, a modest apartment in a different part of the city, a life that was structured in its geography and its financial profile around a person starting over. Xavier brought this picture to Krista, the conversation they had in their apartment late at night after a week of the most careful and controlled exterior that either of them had maintained in their respective careers, was the conversation that Krista had presumably known at some level was coming. She had known the debt. She had known about the business failure and the collection proceedings. She had not known, or at least this was her account, and it was the account Xavier examined most carefully over the hours that followed, that Caleb had been deliberately engineering a situation in which his death, real or constructed, served a financial purpose. Xavier believed her, not immediately, not completely. But he was a man who had spent 15 years assessing the credibility of accounts under pressure, and what he saw in Krista's face and heard in her voice in that conversation was the specific quality of someone who had not known something and was now processing the implications of it. Not performance. Processing. He believed her. He also understood that believing her did not resolve the situation, because the situation had dimensions that his belief did not touch. The legal dimensions were significant. Krista was legally married to Xavier. She had also been legally married to Caleb, whose death certificate was a legal instrument that had discharged real obligations and altered real property and legal records. Whether the death certificate was legitimately obtained, whether Caleb had manipulated the circumstances of its issuance, whether the amnesia account was fully true or partially constructed, was a question that had implications for multiple legal frameworks simultaneously. Xavier recused himself from any involvement in the legal proceedings because he was married to the central figure in the situation, and because his professional ethics required it. He engaged attorneys who were not him. He also engaged, on Krista's behalf, attorneys who were not him. The Swiss authorities reopened aspects of the original accident investigation in light of the new information. The investigation was not quick, and it was not simple. Alpine accident reconstructions involving an individual who had survived but been misidentified were not common territory for any jurisdiction, and the legal questions around the debt discharge, whether it constituted fraudulent misrepresentation, whether Caleb had engineered the circumstances that produced it, were questions that required the intersection of Swiss civil law, Illinois domestic law, and federal considerations around the misuse of official documentation. Caleb Monroe was not charged with fraud. The investigation could not establish, beyond the standard required for criminal proceedings, that the amnesia account was constructed rather than genuine. The medical documentation held. The discharge of his debts through the death certificate was reviewed and ultimately determined, under the specific circumstances, to not constitute prosecutable fraud on the current evidence. He walked. He moved away from Chicago. Xavier and Krista know where he is. They have not had contact with him since the legal proceedings concluded. Xavier and Krista are still married. This is the part of the story that surprises people most consistently, and it is the part that Xavier, in the account he has given to close friends rather than to the public, addresses most directly. He said, "I am a defense attorney. My job is to understand the difference between what someone did and what the evidence proves they knew when they did it. I applied that same framework to my wife, and what the evidence showed me, after the most thorough investigation I have ever applied to anything, and I have applied investigations to a great many things, was a woman who had been through something real, had rebuilt herself honestly, and had married me in good faith. He said, the alternative, that she was part of a constructed scheme from the beginning, required me to disbelieve a quality of grief and a quality of rebuilding that I watched for 2 years up close. I am not a naive man. I could not disbelieve it. He also said, Caleb is not dead. That fact is permanently part of my marriage. We have had to decide what to do with a fact that does not go away. We are still deciding, but we are deciding together. Krista went back to Mercy General. The surgical wing opened 8 months after the fundraiser. The ribbon cutting was attended by the mayor and 2 board members of the research institution that had provided the major grant. She stood at the podium and spoke about the patients the wing would serve and the staff who had made it possible. She was precise and warm and completely present. The event was not covered by any of the journalists who had covered the story of the man in the doorway. It was covered by the hospital's communications team. The photographs were good. Krista is smiling in all of them. Xavier is in the last one. He is standing at the edge of the frame, slightly behind the crowd, with the expression of a man who is watching someone he has chosen to stand beside. He looks like he means it. That is the story of Xavier and Krista. The death certificate, the fundraiser, the man in the doorway with the surgical scar and the familiar eyes, and the 2 people who had to decide in the aftermath what the truth of their marriage actually was. Drop a comment below. What do you think? Did Caleb construct the whole thing? Did Krista know more than she admitted? And what do you think of Xavier's decision to stay? Is that the most rational decision he has ever made, or the most irrational one? Tell me everything. This is the story that has the comment section divided like nothing else, and I want the full debate. And if you are not subscribed to Corporate Chaos Scandals, hit that button right now. Like this video. Share this one especially, because this is the story you tell someone and watch their face change. We are here every single week. I'll see you in the next one.